soup spoon in my hand went still when my mother-in-law leaned across the table and said, in rapid Italian, "Does he have any idea how much the apartment is worth?" I set the spoon down. Slowly, the way you set something down when your hands have gone cold and your brain is running about 3 seconds behind your face. My father-in-law laughed, low and comfortable, the laugh of a man who was very sure he was in the room with the right people. "He's an accountant from Ohio," he said, still in Italian. "He thinks Genoa is a type of salami." That got a bigger laugh. My wife's brother, sitting 2 seats down, nearly choked on his bread. I reached for my wine glass, smiled at my mother-in-law, said in English, "This minestrone is incredible, Adriana. What's your secret?" She beamed. "Peamed recipe, 30 years. You can really taste it," I said. And I went back to listening. "My name is Scott Whitmore. I'm 41 years old. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, spent 4 years at Ohio State, worked another 12 years as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Cincinnati before transferring to our Milan office in 2014. I lived there for 3 years. 3 years of struggling through language lessons on lunch breaks, of making embarrassing mistakes at the corner trattoria, of slowly, painfully becoming functional in Italian, then fluent, then by the time I left in 2017, genuinely comfortable in ways that sometimes surprised even me. My wife Elena didn't know any of this. We met in Chicago in 2019 at a conference for international trade compliance. She was there representing her family's import business out of Genoa. I was there on behalf of my firm. We talked for 40 minutes at the cocktail hour, and by the end of it, I had her business card and the very specific feeling that I'd met someone unusual. She spoke perfect English. I spoke perfect English. We communicated entirely in English throughout our entire courtship and 3-year marriage. She mentioned her Italian background often, warmly, the way people do when they're proud of where they're from. I nodded, asked questions, said that sounded wonderful. I never mentioned Milan. Why not? People ask me that now. And the honest answer is, it never came up naturally, and then it became a kind of private thing. Like a book you've read that the other person hasn't. You're not hiding it. You're just not performing it. Elena knew I'd worked abroad. She knew vaguely it had been Europe. She'd never asked for specifics and I'd never volunteered them. And somewhere in the comfortable ease of our early relationship, it just became a fact that existed only inside me. Call it a private room in the house. Every person has one. Mine happened to be furnished with 3 years of Italian grammar and memories of a 1-bedroom apartment off Via Torino. The dinner had been Elena's idea. Her parents were visiting from Genoa. Her father Massimo, her mother Adriana, her brother Federico and his wife, and she wanted to do a proper welcome dinner at the house. I'd been looking forward to it. I'd met them twice before, briefly, and they'd always been pleasant, a little formal, a little assessing, the usual thing you get from the family of a woman who married a man they didn't choose for her. We sat down at 6. By 6:15, the Italian had started. It always starts slowly. A phrase here, a comment there, just for convenience. Then the convenience becomes habit, and the habit becomes default, and suddenly the table has 2 conversations happening, and you're the only one at the only one you can hear. I'd been through this before. In Milan, before my Italian was good enough, I'd sat through business dinners feeling exactly this way, present in body, absent in understanding. So I knew what to do. Eat, nod, smile at the right moments. Let your eyes stay engaged even when your comprehension was 0. Except my comprehension was not 0. The apartment on Via Alberici, Adriana said in Italian, spooning minestrone into her bowl, is worth at least 800,000 euros now, maybe more. More, Massimo said. The market there has been insane since 2021. It was always going to be Elena's, Adriana continued. Before any of this. Before any of this. I noted the phrasing. Kept eating. She can still have it, Federico said. That's the point of the conversation. What conversation? Massimo said. We're having dinner. Papa. Federico's tone was the specific patience of a son correcting a father who was being deliberately obtuse. You know what I mean? Elena was quiet at her end of the table. I looked at her. She was turning her wine glass by the stem just slightly back and forth, not looking at me. "The prenuptial question is closed," Massimo said in Italian. "They didn't sign one." "That's done." "That's not done. There are lawyers for exactly that situation." Federico tore a piece of bread. "The apartment has been in the family since 1987. A judge in Italy would agree it should stay in the family." "We're in America," Adriana said. "We're talking about an apartment in Italy." I took a sip of wine. The wine was very good. Elena had picked it out, a Barolo from her producer near Alba. She knew I liked Barolo. I told her that early on, when we were dating, that it was my favorite Italian wine. She'd thought it was sweet that the Ohio accountant had a favorite Italian wine. She hadn't asked how I'd come to have one. "He seems like a reasonable man," Adriana said in Italian, nodding in my direction without looking at me. "If Elena approaches it correctly, he won't fight it." "Elena has to want to approach it," Massimo said. Federico made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. "She doesn't want the disruption, but she also doesn't want to lose the property. These are not incompatible things. You just have to sequence it correctly." "What does correctly mean?" Adriana asked. "It means you start with the property conversation. Just the apartment, just the inheritance question. You frame it as a family legacy issue, not a marriage issue. He'll probably agree immediately. He's the type." "He's the type." I had to work fairly hard not to look up. "And then?" Adriana said. Federico shrugged. "Then you have documentation. You have precedent. Other conversations become easier." Other conversations. I understood exactly which other conversations he meant. I looked at Elena. She was looking at her plate. Her jaw was set in a way I recognized, the particular tension she got when she was hearing something she didn't like, but had decided not to fight. I'd seen it in disagreements with her boss. I'd seen it when she got bad news about a project. I'd never seen it aimed at a table that included me. The dinner continued. The bread basket got refilled. Adriana told a long story in Italian about a neighbor in Genoa who had remodeled his kitchen disastrously. Federico and his wife discussed something about their kids' school. Massimo ate and made periodic pronouncements about the state of the import business. And every so often the conversation would drift back. Little fragments, the apartment, the question of what was family property versus marital property, whether American courts would even have jurisdiction, whether Elena had spoken to anyone yet, anyone being, I gathered, a lawyer they knew in Genoa. Elena said at one point, very quietly in Italian, "Not yet." And Adriana said, "It shouldn't wait too long." And Elena said nothing. I set down my fork. Very carefully. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me. I felt like I was watching myself from the outside. This accountant from Ohio, sitting at his own dinner table, listening to his wife's family discuss the choreography of separating him from a piece of Italian real estate he'd never even heard of, while he sat there smiling and being the type who wouldn't fight it, the type who'd sign what you put in front of him, the type who thought Genoa was a kind of salami. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, and then I set it down, looked at Adriana, and said, in Italian, "The apartment on Via Albrici. Is that the one near the Palazzo Reale, or the other side of the Duomo?" The sound that followed was not exactly silence. It was the specific acoustic event that happens when 5 people inhale at the same time and none of them speak. Adriana's face went through about 4 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise was first, then something I can only describe as a recalculation. Massimo's fork stopped moving. Federico stared at me. Elena, across the table, had gone very still in the way of a person who is resorting an enormous amount of information very quickly. Via Albrici, I continued in Italian, is a nice street, good light. I always liked that part of the city. I spent a lot of time in that neighborhood when I lived off Via Torino. "You speak Italian," Massimo said. In Italian, and then, as if catching himself, switched to English. "You speak Italian." "Reasonably well," I said in English. "I lived in Milan for 3 years. 2014 to 2017. I should have mentioned it earlier. I apologize for the oversight. I smiled at him pleasantly. He did not smile back. Elena said my name. Just my name, very quietly, like a question that wasn't quite a question. I heard everything I said in English, looking at her. From the apartment on Via Alberci to the part where Federico said to sequence it correctly so other conversations would be easier. I looked at Federico. That was well put, by the way. Clean strategic thinking. Federico's wife looked at Federico. Federico did not look at his wife. I'm going to clear the soup bowls, I said, and then I think we should talk, all of us, in whatever language everyone's comfortable with. I'm flexible. I carried the bowls into the kitchen. I stood at the sink for about 30 seconds with the water running. Not washing anything, just standing there. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear the low, rapid Italian of a family conference happening without me. I caught enough to know it was mostly recrimination. Federico and Adriana going back and forth, Elena saying very little, Massimo making short declarative statements that sounded like a man accepting a loss he hadn't anticipated. I dried my hands. I went back out. The Italian stopped when I came into the room. Okay, I said, sitting down. I'll start since I seem to have the clearest picture of what's been discussed tonight. I looked around the table. There's an apartment in Genoa, Via Alberci, that belongs to this family. It's valuable. The family would like it to remain family property, which is a reasonable thing to want. The question is how to accomplish that, and at some point that question became connected to the question of whether Elena's marriage to me was a permanent arrangement. I looked at Elena. Is that accurate? She didn't look away. Scott, is it accurate? A long pause. It's not that simple. Okay, then explain the parts I'm missing. What followed was the most uncomfortable 2 hours of my adult life. Massimo explained, in careful measured English, that the apartment had been purchased by his parents in 1987 and was always intended to pass through the family. He said he had concerns that without proper documentation it could become complicated. He said he was not suggesting anything about the marriage. Federico, who was less careful than his father, said that Elena had mentioned at some point that things had been difficult, that she had felt like she and I were in different places, that she didn't know if the marriage was where she expected to be at this point in her life. I looked at Elena. Is that true? She looked at her hands. I've been struggling, she said. I didn't know how to say it. You could have said it. To me. In English. Over the 3 years we've been married. I know. Instead of having a structural discussion with your family about how to sequence the property question so that other conversations become easier. She flinched. I know. Adriana started to say something. I held up one hand, not aggressively, just firmly. I'm going to ask you to let Elena and me have this part of the conversation, I said in Italian, because I felt like it made the point more clearly. She and I are the ones who are married. Adriana closed her mouth. We talked, all of us, and then just Elena and me, long after her family had gone to the guest rooms with the specifically uncomfortable courtesy of people who had been caught doing something and were trying to walk it back with good manners. Elena and I sat at the cleared table with the last of the Barolo between us and said the things that hadn't been said for apparently quite a while. She was unhappy. She had been for longer than I'd understood. Not dramatically, not in any way that had set off clear alarms, but in the quiet, persistent way of someone who had drifted and didn't know how to ask for help, navigating back. She talked to her family instead of to me, and her family, being her family, had moved immediately to asset protection as the practical expression of their love. That was Massimo in a sentence. His first response to any problem was to build a wall around the valuable things. I understood it better than I probably should have. In accounting, you do something similar. We didn't resolve anything that night. You can't resolve what Elena and I had to resolve in one conversation, but we made an appointment with a couples therapist the following week, which is its own kind of document, an acknowledgement that there is something here worth working on, that neither of you has decided to stop. Her family left on Sunday. The goodbye was stiff. Federico and I shook hands with the energy of two people who had said things that could not be unsaid. Adriana kissed my cheeks with determined warmth and said the minestrone recipe was in a notebook she'd left on the kitchen counter, which I think was an apology. Massimo shook my hand and held it a beat longer than necessary and said in Italian, "You are not what I expected." "I know," I said. "That's not a bad thing," he said. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I noted the effort. The apartment question got resolved eventually, through actual lawyers and actual documentation, the way it should have been from the beginning. Elena and I agreed that the Via Albrici property was family inheritance and put it in writing, which took about 6 weeks and cost each of us some legal fees and a fair amount of paperwork. The lawyer we used was a dual jurisdiction specialist in Chicago who handled exactly these kinds of Italian-American estate questions, and she said, with the specific flat affect of someone who has seen everything, that it was actually quite a clean solution given the circumstances. Elena said that her family was relieved. I said I was glad. The marriage is different now. I'm not sure different is the same as better. I think that's still being determined. But we see the therapist every 2 weeks, and we talk about things we didn't used to talk about, and Elena has said more than once that the dinner, terrible as it was, forced a conversation she'd been avoiding for over a year, that if I hadn't spoken Italian, if the whole thing had stayed submerged, she isn't sure what would have happened, but she's fairly sure it wouldn't have been good. I've thought about that a lot. The counterfactual. The version of that dinner where I sit there nodding, not understanding, and the sequencing proceeds as planned. I don't love that version. Here's what I've come to understand from all of it. The things people say when they think you can't understand them are usually the truest things. Not because they're being cruel, though sometimes they are, but because they've stopped filtering. They've stopped managing your reaction. They're just saying what is. And sometimes what is something you needed to know. I needed to know Elena was struggling. I'd missed it or chosen not to see it, and her family handled it the way her family handles things, which is to secure the assets first and ask questions later. Was it a betrayal? Yes, partly. Was it also a family acting out of the specific cramped love of people who don't know any other way to protect their own? Also, yes. Both things can be true. I've learned that from accounting. 2 numbers can occupy the same column for different reasons and both be accurate. Elena knows I speak Italian now, obviously. She's asked me more than once if there were other things I'd understood over the years, other conversations, other moments at other family gatherings, and I've told her the truth, which is a few things, nothing major, nothing that amounted to more than the ordinary background noise of a family being a family in their own language. She doesn't entirely believe me, but she's choosing to, which is its own kind of grace. I've started studying more consistently again. My Italian got rusty during the years I wasn't using it daily, and I'd like to get back to where I was. There's a conversation class on Tuesday evenings at the community center near our house. 3 other students, a retired teacher who spent 2 years in Florence, a woman in her 30s who is planning a trip to Rome, a young guy who just likes languages. Nobody knows how I got into Italian. They assume I took a class somewhere, studied on my own. I don't correct them. Some things you keep private. Not because they're secrets exactly, just because they're yours. The soup spoon, the wine glass, the silence at the table when I opened my mouth and the wrong language came out. Sometimes I think about that room, those faces. The very precise moment when 5 people understood that they'd been having a different dinner than they thought. There's a satisfaction in that moment that I'm not entirely proud of. But I'm not going to pretend it isn't there. Genoa is a type of salami. It's also a city on the Ligurian coast with a harbor that smells like salt and diesel and, in the right light in the right season, looks like something out of a painting you'd fly a long way to see in person. I know because I've been there. Before Elena. Before any of this. I walked those streets alone, on a weekend trip from Milan, eating focaccia from a place near the old port, watching the fishing boats come in. I never mentioned it. She never asked. I think about that sometimes, all the things that exist inside a person that the other person doesn't know yet, that might change everything or might change nothing, that are just sitting there quietly in the dark, waiting for the right dinner conversation to bring them into the light. I keep coming back to that soup spoon, The moment I set it down, the way my hands weren't shaking when, by every reasonable measure, they should have been. There's something that happens when you've spent enough time being honest with yourself, really honest, not the comfortable kind, that prepares you for moments like that dinner. You don't panic because you've already done the harder internal work of knowing what you value and why. That's not something that arrives overnight. It builds slowly, through years of choosing to pay attention, to stay curious, to keep learning, even when there's no immediate reason to. I didn't study Italian because I knew one day my wife's family would sit at my table and discuss my property rights in a language they assumed I didn't speak. I studied it because I was living in a place and I thought it was right to understand the people around me. That instinct, the one that says pay attention, stay honest, keep developing, it compounds over time in ways you can't predict and can't manufacture after the fact. What happened with Elena's family was, at its core, a failure of honesty operating in multiple directions at once. They weren't honest with me. Elena hadn't been fully honest with me about her unhappiness. And if I'm being fair, I hadn't been fully honest either with her about Milan, yes, but also with myself about the quiet signs I'd been choosing not to read for longer than I'd admitted. The universe, or just the simple logic of cause and effect, tends to surface what you've been avoiding. The longer you avoid it, the harder the surface. What I've learned from all of it, the dinner, the lawyers, the uncomfortable Tuesday evenings in a therapist's office, is that courage and integrity are not dramatic things. They don't arrive wearing a cape. They show up as, say the true thing, even when the room goes quiet. Ask the direct question, even when you're afraid of the answer. Don't let shame about what you missed keep you from addressing what you now know. Federico's plan relied entirely on me being passive, on me being, as he put it, the type. The type who wouldn't push back, wouldn't ask hard questions, would sign things to avoid conflict. That's a reasonable assumption about a lot of people. We're trained, most of us, to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to accept the polite version of events. But peace bought through silence isn't peace. It's just debt you're not accounting for yet. The perseverance piece of this, and it was the hardest part, not the dinner, not the reveal, but the months after, was staying at the table. Literally and figuratively, not walking away from Elena because the easier thing would have been to end it and start clean. Not walking away from the work of repairing something that had been damaged, partly by neglect on both sides. Showing up to the therapist's office when I didn't want to. Answering hard questions about my own patterns, honestly, when it would have been easier to make her the only villain in the story. She wasn't. I wasn't. Massimo wasn't entirely. People protect what they love in the ways they know how. And sometimes those ways are wrong, and what you do when you find that out tells you more about yourself than the finding out ever could. I'm still in that conversation class on Tuesday evenings. My Italian is coming back. Last week, the retired teacher told me my accent was surprisingly good for someone who learned from a class. I didn't correct her.